Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of All in Education's Sepas. I'd like to welcome today's experts. We have Stephanie Parra back with us. She's the Executive Director, of course, of All in Education. So excited to have Mr. Kareem Neal on the couch with us, Special Education Teacher and Restorative Justice Trainer, Maryvale High School, Phoenix Union High School District, and 2019 Teacher of the Year and 2020 National Teachers Hall of Fame. All right, excited. Also with us on the couch today, we have Dr. Luis Alberto Fernandez, Chair, Criminology and Criminal Justice, Northern Arizona University. So excited to have these guests with us today. Before we get into our discussion, a little bit about All in Education. All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Through this monthly Sepas series, All in Education is working to bridge their advocacy efforts across multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Sepas will focus on having real, thought-provoking conversations like the one we're going to have today with leaders and community members and identify solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. Now, today's conversation will focus on covering a long-standing issue that has plagued schools, communities, and students of color for a long time. The school-to-prison pipeline is the practice which pushes kids out of school and into the juvenile and criminal systems. Now, the school-to-prison pipeline is not something that just happens here in Arizona or in low-income neighborhoods. It's something that's been occurring nationally and across all schools. Further that, this practice disproportionately impacts Black and brown kids and students with disabilities. And it's one thing for us to talk about it, but it's another to truly show impact. We want to share a story with you. Here's David's story.
I'm a son of a convicted felon, in and out of prison growing up and not really around as a solid father figure. From there, just being exposed to visiting prisons at a young age, talking to siblings and my father through telephone and a panel, spending holidays sometimes waiting in line to get into a jail and find a time to visit. So not knowing the trauma I think that I was experiencing at that age, and then where that was influencing maybe my pathway. Single mom raising 3 kids and worrying about food on the table, clothes on her back, staying warm sometimes, and then will things get better? And then when things started to get a little bit better, my mom was able to uplift us a bit and moved us into safer zip codes, better schools a bit. That's when I think I realized the difference. My exposure to the criminal justice system compared to my friends, and not having those same experiences as others. It probably started happening in high school where friends of mine had the family and the love and the support, and after graduation, they all kind of went and did their thing. They went to college, some of them had careers already lined up, and I didn't have any of that. And I think that's where a light bulb was going off. It's like, hey, I'm missing something here. Just graduating high school, was an accomplishment in my household. So beyond that, it was, okay, hey, you met the minimum expectations from the house. Now you're on your own. Worked at the airport for a couple years here in Arizona, super hot. I realized, all right, I'm working with guys that blue collar jobs, but guys that are 40, 50 years old, but they look 70 or 80, and I didn't want that. I didn't want that for me. Finding ways to pay for school was a challenge. So fortunately, I was able to find some loopholes with actually working on campuses, in different roles. They would actually pay for your tuition. If you were a counselor, if you were maintenance, doing anything on the campuses, you can go to school for free. So I found those opportunities and latched on to pursuing higher education to create those opportunities for me to kind of move on and move up, break those generational cycles. It's bittersweet for me now as a dad, as a father of 2, and I'm seeing all these opportunities where I'm investing in my family, to say those small moments, to say I love you, to support them, encourage them, invest in their interests, however silly they are. I miss that. I didn't have that. And I mentioned it being bittersweet, and that's because, man, if I had that, could I have been where I'm at sooner? Could I have done something different? Could I have been successful earlier on in life? And helping those same opportunity youth with our workforce programs, helping them to get those opportunities that they need to remove barriers such as housing or food insecurities. That's what our programs are able to do. So it's come full circle for me. If I could tell another young Latinx or BIPOC community, member, young youth and young adult, that opportunities are there and they have the ability to break those generational cycles and make their own path through their journey.
Wow. Stephanie, again, the stories that you guys are able to share are just incredible. And so for this topic today, can you help us, and we've heard of the school to prison pipeline before, but give us some context, what it is and how this phenomenon is impacting students of color.
Yeah. It's important to start framing this conversation under the larger umbrella of school safety, which is kind of where it was born out of. And I think it's important for school and system leaders to be mindful of how we address school safety and making sure that our campuses are safe and secure while not over policing or criminalizing young people of color, which has happened historically, and that's where the term school to prison pipeline comes from.
And we're going to go into some data and research, and Dr. Fernandez, bring you into this conversation. You have an extensive background in criminal justice, and with your work at NAU have conducted a lot of research on this. Talking about the disciplinary practices, the history of policing in schools. So can you share some of that research of what you've learned and how these policies and practices impact Black, Latino, and Native communities and students with disabilities?
Sure. Sure. I think that one of the things that we need to know is that the data is not collected in ways that makes it particularly easy for us to understand what's happening. Okay. So that is that when we look at the data in relation to the impact that particular kinds of law enforcement in the schools are present, and to understand what happens, the data is not collected that way. So the data, we don't have the data of what happens in schools that have officers and in schools that don't have officers. So we have generalized data. In the generalized data, we know that the impact is actually not it's not good. And that is that this connection between safety and harm is not quite as direct as you might imagine. That is that as we talk about trying to keep something safe, we can produce an enormous amount of harm. So the harm comes in with the connection between law enforcement that have been built to connect to engage with crime and criminal activity in particular kinds of ways, and as they connect with students, they create particular kinds of practices. And those practices, in the long run, the data shows that there's a disparity in relation to how disciplinary action is applied, and it creates certain populations are engaged in an entirely different way. So in Arizona, African Americans and Indigenous people are more likely to be suspended or referred or engage in legal action way higher, sometimes 3 to 4 times as other kinds of populations. Latinos are around the same represented in the population, maybe a little bit higher, but one of the main effects is that having law enforcement engage in the schools tends to create a desperate interaction with the population.
Mr. Neal, you've been in the classroom now for almost 25 years. What's your perspective as you hear us discuss this?
Yeah, so what I see a lot of times in my campus and in the schools that I've been fortunate enough to travel around in is that the students who don't feel as connected to the school are the students who, one, are often being dealt with by security or sometimes POs for schools that have them. But two, those are the students that are saying, because I'm talking to them, they're saying, school's not really for us, and it's hard for a student to feel that way, but a lot of them are, and that is because in a lot of classrooms and a lot of spaces on schools, whether it be educators or peers or whatever, they're focusing on the students who have picked up academics quick, whether it be they started school, their parents read to them, they're young, and they built this this kind of strong academic skills that have caused people to say, oh, they're great students, and they take them in, and they're like the favorites of teachers and things like that. oftentimes a lot of the other students are saying, well, they're not here for me. And so once they have disconnected from the school, it is really tricky for them to, to not then get sent to the office or to skip school or some of those things that kind of get them on that path of having discipline problems. And, once it happens, for me, every time I've seen a student who's been suspended for a significant amount of time or expelled at all, and sometimes people get expelled and they get to come back, they're just even further disconnected from the school, and then that cycle plays on. So it is a scary thought, because I want to like bring all the students in and say, if we can find a way to like love them all the same, maybe we have a shot.
So Stephanie, now back to the conversation on school safety. How is this connected to school safety? And then talking about how this impacts academic outcomes.
Yeah. So it does, this is connected to school safety, because I think what has happened historically is, in our efforts to maintain campuses, maintain the safety of campuses, we've reacted and some brought, police into the school community as a measure to create a safe atmosphere. But I think what Mr. Neal said is so critical here, is that if we're going to focus on having safe schools, we have to build a strong school culture and a strong mentorship between the adults on campus and between the young people on campus, and really build that positive relationship between educators and students. And so I think that as we're talking about safety, we have to really focus on the relationships that we're building, and that has to be part of the solution and the discussion going forward, so that we don't end up unintentionally creating environments that actually cause more harm than they do improve the safety of the campus community.
Yeah, and you were just telling us what you hear from the students, so what advice do you have for the educators?
I would say find a way. I always tell educators when I get a chance to speak to them about restorative justice, because I do speak to a lot of educators in Arizona, it's like, find a way to make every student like a potential favorite student. And that is, whether it be eliminating your biases, whether it be saying I can find the good in everyone because everyone has good in them, whether it is pay no attention to their disciplinary past and say, what are they giving you in their class? Because a lot of the students I'm talking to will say, oh, well, it would be nice if they were all like you, talking to me. And I was like, well, it is the way they have connected to you, and sometimes people just connect better with certain personalities or whatever. But I would tell teachers, find a way to connect with them all, find a way to make your classroom a strong community, and then try and spill it out to your school. Because as you do that, you would see a student's like, okay, if they feel they belong here, they have a voice, they're respected, they're loved, then they're going to want to be in your class every day, which is part of the big problem is attendance, right? And then they're not going to want to cause harm to that area and that space. And it is huge to find a way to connect with everyone, and it's hard, right? I'm a special education teacher; it's kind of what we learn, but when you do it, it'll pay dividends. And one, the way you can instruct. So it's not so hard for me to instruct. We were talking before the show started, and I was talking about how I have a lot of students this year, more students than I've ever had, because there's teacher shortages and things like that. But I was like, it's fine, because we've kind of built this strong community in my classroom, and so it's everybody does feel like they have a chance for their needs to get met. And with that, then you don't have to worry about, oh, they're just being sent to the office and we get to forget about them, right? It's like no, I'm going to make sure I love them all and save them all, right? And so that's the mindset that I wish people had.
Love that, man. Love that perspective. Dr. Fernandez, let's bring research back into the conversation. And what Stephanie said opening this episode was, how do we find that balance between school safety and preventing the school to prison pipeline? Like, what does the research tell you that we could potentially be doing to find that balance?
Yeah, much of the work that I've been doing is really looking at the involvement of school resource officers, both historically and the effects that they might have on the school in relation to safety. One of the things that I have found as I read the literature and I look at things is that the concept of safety is a double-edged sword. and that is that we often tend to look at the most extreme cases and then begin to think about safety around those kinds of cases. So of course, anything that has to do with a threat, anything that has to do with a shooting, anything that has to, but those are relatively rare cases. However, they're devastating cases, right? But they are relatively rare. But what begins to happen is that we tend to think of safety around that particular kind of concept, and the notion of security tends to permeate across a variety of other actions that students might engage in that probably doesn't belong there. So some of the things that people are doing in order to balance this is beginning to separate those things and beginning to think about both the idea of safety in the narrow sense of which are the locations that actually produce interpersonal violence or kind of violence, and what do we do in order to do that, but also tend to think of the production of harm that occurs in entire populations when the criminal justice system connects with the young people. So you can have individuals that are engaged in minor activity that end up being referred to the criminal justice system and engage in a variety of different things, and now enter the system and end up having labeling issues, connection issues, long-lasting effects. So part of what people are doing is trying to figure out how to create a firewall that separates safety and harm, so that we actually can maintain safety in the most narrow sense of that, so that we can secure that, while at the same time not make sure that that some of that criminal justice system doesn't enter some of the other actions. And what do you need for that? You need teachers, you need people that are trained in a variety of different kinds of trainings that actually de-escalate, reduce, engage, produce community, and all of those things. So that's what's happening across the nation.
Let's talk for a minute about restorative justice. So can you kind of explain to the audience what that is exactly?
Yes. So it's an approach to, I would say, building community. A lot of people have heard it and they think about it as a replacement discipline. That's not it, actually. Okay. So what it is it's saying that you can restore relationships if you build them strong enough, right? So that's actually the crux of it. So it's saying build community, build a strong community in your classroom. It's typically done in just classrooms as opposed to larger communities. Build a strong community in classrooms so that if harm happens, you can restore these relationships, right? And so that's kind of where restorative justice comes from. And while you're doing it, it does eliminate a lot of those biases, right? So you essentially sit in community building circles. This is like the crux of it, and you get to all talk about, you know, your passions, your love, your life, your fears, so that you know someone well enough that if something happens, you can say, hey, let's talk about this, as opposed to that person's interrupting my class, I got to send them out, right? And so this is where the restorative aspect comes in. So even if you do have to discipline a student, right? A fight happened, you're gonna have to discipline a student. When they come back, they do have to sit, talk about it, reflect on it, so you can understand people better. So it's more about it's like a community building tool, but it'll help you restore relationships and restore kind of your community.
Thank you for that explanation, community building,
I was just going to add, I think this is an important approach. You mentioned, you know, that schools across the country are probably implementing these kinds of practices and strategies, and I think the transition and moving away from the zero tolerance policies of the push-out policies of you got into a fight, you can't come back here. There's no additional resources or supports for students, and so I think that's the transition in the right direction that we should be going to create those campus climate and culture where it is a welcoming, inclusive environment where students feel supported. Everyone feels supported, so that that students can continue to thrive even if they make mistakes, because everyone does make mistakes at times, right?
And I think in terms of in the field of criminology, when we study the system of punishment, and that is a system that is counter to everything that you just described. That is, it's a system that is engaged with saying, you did something wrong, here's a punishment, in order to create deterrence, because the idea is if we punish you, other people will not do that. This is a long-standing idea. Here is going, no, it's entered the schools. It probably shouldn't be there with juveniles. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't seem to produce the kinds of effects. And now we need to re-engage in ways that we used to do to make it so that we're not engaged in punishment, punitive, pushing out, exclusionary policies, but rather engaging in community, so that when there is a wrong that's doing, what you do is you rebuild and you undo the harm rather than punish or exclude.
And Stephanie, you know, listening to it, it's kind of obvious now, but you know, we talk about this in each episode. Why did you choose this topic, you know, school to prison pipeline as a social determinant of education?
Yeah, it was important for us to include this into the social determinants of education framework because it does impact educational attainment. If a student is not in school, and you know, if they're pushed out of school, for example, or disciplined a little too aggressively and don't have access to learning opportunities outside of that experience, it will affect their long-term success. It will affect their trajectory. And so for us, it was important to make sure that when we're talking about closing opportunity gaps in the system, that this is a topic that we are willing to take on and confront and change so that students have the environments that they need to be successful.
You just talked about long-term effects, Dr. Fernandez, long-term effects on communities.
Yeah.
What do you see happening there?
Oh, wow. I mean, these policies have been in place slowly for the last 30 or 40 years, meaning that they've come into place in the 50s and continue to grow throughout. So I think we're just starting to understand really the effects, and we're still just starting to see the undoing of them, which is really exciting because there's a shift happening, and it's wonderful to see. I mean, you can talk about the effects are quite simple. As soon as a young person gets involved with the criminal justice system, in other words, something happens in the school and they begin to enter that system in whatever way, even if it's through a referral, through an arrest, sometimes it can be a minor situation. Once you enter the criminal justice system, that system is not restorative for the most part. There are some practices there that try to do that, but they're not. So the effect is that individual now enters a particular system that has a tendency to capture and recapture and continue. So one of the ideas is to reduce that so that young people are not entering that system, create that firewall, separate them. They don't enter that system in the hopes that that means that 3 years later they're no longer entangled with that particular system. The long-term effects are the labeling that occurs for a young person, the expulsion that may happen from a particular school, the inability to continue through school. If you actually get penalized with a felony or something in some misdemeanors, that means that you may not be able to get jobs later. So the impacts are tremendous. And when you look at the fact that the impacts are disparate, meaning that some communities are engaged in that system more than others, that tells you that those communities are going to have long-term impacts in relation to labor, education, movement, attainment, movement through education in a variety of ways. So that's what I think the disruption of that pipeline is all about.
And we've been talking a lot on this episode, research, data, but we are talking about human beings too and getting down to it. And we're going to talk about, you know, solutions here. And so, Mr. Neal, we'll start with you. What are some of the solutions you think, maybe even some of the resources to help solve some of the issues we're talking about here today?
Well, we definitely need restorative justice in schools. We need restorative schools, I'll call them. So schools that make a commitment to it. I often have schools that have me in for a day and then I see them maybe a year later, and that's not quite a commitment to it, right? So we need commitment to restorative justice in schools. We need more social workers in schools. I know there was an influx. I know our legislator did do some solid work with that. And we need more teachers in schools. We were just talking about the shortages in Phoenix Union, but those shortages are around the country and around Arizona at large. Having enough teachers gives us the opportunity to have smaller class sizes. I was just talking about how my class is expanding. And that does make it tougher to kind of build the strong classroom community as you have classes that are overpacked or classes where there's a substitute teacher in for a couple weeks and there's a new substitute teacher. So we need more teachers, we need more social workers, and we need restorative justice in schools.
Stephanie, before I bring you in for some final thoughts and some solutions, I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Fernandez, on, after hearing all of your research, what you think some actionable solutions might be in this area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting things is there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Lots of, we identified 46 different districts across the U.S. that are engaged in this kind of work from every state. In the any state, and that are doing a variety of different things. I think we're going to find people are implementing. We're going to find out which ones are the most effective strategies coming up. So that's research that's coming up. However, in the short term, there's a variety of different things. Given the work that I do, one of the things that I've been engaging is, again, trying to create that firewall from the criminal justice system to the school. So that is so that's the big idea, is how to make sure that there's a firewall so that those systems don't engage with the students. What does that mean? That means it's not just pulling out the police officers that might get close to them and might engage in particular kinds of behaviors, but also means what was just said, creating the systems in place that keep people safe and reduce harm. What is that? That is psychological harm, that is physical harm, that is emotional, that is engaging in a variety of different things that we need with food security, with all of those kinds of things, those kinds of services that had been destroyed for the last 30 to 40 years that we now need to rebuild because we have relied on law enforcement and the criminal justice system in particular kinds of ways. So what do we need? We need teams of individuals that are working together, that have the expertise in the mind of a child, that have the expertise in what happens at the home, that have the expertise of what's happening in the classroom, how they learn best, how are they fed, and they all need to be working together. So whenever there's an emergency or an issue, that's what responds and what catches the young people, rather than, oh my goodness, we have an emergency, a law enforcement person comes, very well intentioned, but they have particular kinds of tools that may not be the best for every situation.
And Stephanie, what a dynamic conversation we've had here. So
Yeah.
I'm going to let you close us out with some final thoughts, but also offer up what some of those solutions you think we should bring to the table.
Yeah, I think these are all brilliant solutions and so important. The one I would add on top of these is just make sure that when we are coming up with these solutions, that the community voice is present and at the table, that parents have their say, that educators, that students have a voice. The key stakeholders that we are trying to help here need to be present in conversations and in the decision making, because at the end of the day, if it falls under the umbrella of school safety, what does that mean to each individual stakeholder group, and how do they define it, and where do we need to align, where do we differ, and again, some of these solutions, I just also want to double down on the importance of the relationships and what Mr. Neal said. Getting more teachers in the classroom. You can't build strong, effective relationships if you have 30, 40, 50 kids in your classroom. And so if the most important thing for a child is to have a very strong relationship with an educator on their campus, we have to make sure that we have the workforce to meet it.
Dr. Fernandez, Mr. Neal, Stephanie, of course, thank you so much. Thank everyone for joining us on this edition of Paque Sepas. As a reminder, we'll be continuing the conversation each and every month, and we do want to send a special thank you to the Garcia Family Foundation for supporting this series. We thank you so much, and please make sure you tune in next month as we continue these discussions around the social determinants of education. Thanks you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.